So hi everybody, today is our upper woodwind class. So we have Matt Ross and we will eventually have Colin Lewis joining us on flute and clarinet. And I think we're going to start right off with a question from Micah, which I guess then you'll ask again for Colin also.
Yeah, I wanted to ask both of you because I was saying you described the mechanics of the instrument quite thoroughly, which was really awesome. And so, yeah, my follow-up question is just what are there certain things like pet peeves that you have of specific things that conductors might ask, or are there certain things that you have noticed that conductors kind of don't think about when
Yeah. Well,
stuff like that.
I think I touched on it in the video a little bit, but the hardest thing about being a flute player in orchestra is volume.
Of course, yeah,
And
right.
it's just like a constant battle that we have to be able to find the tone quality that we want, that we work so hard for, but also have the volume that we need. And sometimes those things don't quite go together.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to say it's like a huge pet peeve because it's up for interpretation. But when conductors immediately just jump to flute play louder, that's pretty rarely the answer.
Right.
It's usually just some other sort of balance problem. But like, of course, just saying to the one flute player to play louder is obviously a lot easier than trying to bring down an entire string section. But there are just like really pretty firm limitations as to what we can do volume-wise while maintaining a nice sound.
Yeah, so you think for the quality of the sound in general, it's better to actually make the effort to adjust other instrument sections.
Yeah, of course it's like it's situational, and
Yeah.
of course there are times where like yes, your flute player should be playing louder. But if it's something where you hear the player trying to go for this really delicate sound and it's just not getting soft enough, and you feel like it's close to the right balance, it's not like a really, you're not starting at like totally opposite ends of the spectrum. I think it's a better thing to at least attempt to bring other people down, or at least similarly pitched voices, rather than just asking the flute player to play more. Like I find when the violins and violas really play down, the cellos and basses don't so much get in the way of me because of just strictly the difference in the pitch.
Right. Right.
So the ear won't necessarily be so distracted by that as the more similarly pitched instruments.
Okay, that's really good to know. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Hey, man, I'm glad that you're doing well, and thank you for doing this. You kind of hinted on pairings, like with other instruments. So could you like kind of go into a little detail about that? And then also, I thought it was really interesting because you also mentioned like that as a flute player, you have to be mindful of like the shape of your vowels, which is weird because like we don't think that y'all have to shape your vowels. So like, could you kind of talk about pairings and then also the thing about the vowels?
Yeah. So I mean, you could name any pairing with flute, and I could probably tell you some example in orchestral literature where that pairing happens like very prominently. So it's all just about finding the tone quality of these other instruments, and finding the character of these other instruments and mimicking that within myself. And because I have the benefit of not having a mouthpiece against my face or having a reed in my mouth that can be so temperamental on its own, flute players more than other wind instruments have the ability to meld to whatever the situation is. So are any of you guys singers? Oh, Micah is? Cool. So if you want to help me out here, that'd be fine. Have you ever seen an IPA chart? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Here, let me, I have one pulled up on my computer.
Yeah, I thought this part was so very interesting because I didn't know that any instrumentalists like even thought about vowels.
Oh yeah. Constantly thinking about vowels.
I
All right,
love it. I love it. It's so
here,
cool.
there's a great chart that I just put in the chat with the examples of each vowel that you can click on and hear what each vowel open and closed sounds like. Open and closed in the front of the mouth. Mike, I'm sure you're super familiar with this. So what this chart represents is the inside of your mouth. So when you see close, that is the back of the tongue being kind of pushed forward a bit. So if you say E versus oo, and you kind of oscillate between those two vowels, your tongue is staying high but coming forward and back, and that's enough to change tone color. And same thing between, say, oo, which is high and back, and ah, which is back and low. Same thing there. And that's like a basis for just register changes because of the fact that our whole scale is built on harmonic series. So using that to kind of support the differences in air pressure between the ranges and dynamics and all that kind of stuff. And then making modifications to where the like mezzo forte comfort zone is how we kind of get those tone colors.
Matt, could you just say what that chart, that website is, just so somebody listening to this could definitely.
Yeah, it's just ipachart.com.
Yeah, that's pretty easy. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, super easy. Everything, if you go to this website, everything on the left are the open vowels, and that's more what we're thinking of as wind players, and everything to the right is closed vowels, so closed in the front of the mouth. And sometimes we go into that kind of stuff, but very, very rarely, really only for articulated passages where it needs to be a little bit more condensed in the front of the mouth and have a little bit more like firmness in the lips. I hope that answers your question. That was kind of long-winded.
Matt, I just realized that I actually have another question based on that.
Yeah.
Would it ever make any sense for a conductor if they're looking for a different tone quality from a flute player? Would it ever make sense to talk about the shape of the tongue? Because like we do that a lot with singers. Like if you're looking for a different tone quality, you're like, oh, can you get a higher tongue in the back or whatever? But like, would that be just weird?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay.
Honestly, I've never had a conductor say anything about it, but I think it's a good thing for you guys to be aware of.
Okay.
Just aware of the fact that we are thinking about these things, and that is how we're going about the things that you as a conductor would be asking of us. Mm. So I don't know if I would say something like that, but I might. More typical thing would be open up the sound. Right. Mellow out the sound would mean something in relation to this. Like any of those tone quality words can be applied to this. But I think it's just more of an awareness from your end than anything
right else. Okay, I figured, but just thought if that is a cool thing. But all right. Yeah. Cool.
Cool.
How do you guys, like, as flute players, like, how do you build up endurance? I mean, like, I'm sure it's a it's a lifelong learning thing, but I like for me as a pianist, for us, we learn, well, posture is one thing, and then just like how to use our body to get different sounds, and then just kind of build on it over the years. So like, how do you guys build that? Because I know it takes a lot of internal work and whatnot. So how do you guys work on that?
We're pretty lucky in the fact that most of our best sound work comes from really relaxed embouchure, as opposed to other wind instruments where it's very much about focused here, and it can kind of get closed off, and you're using all these muscles pretty intently, and it can get tired pretty quick. The only thing that we sometimes have an issue with is the tongue, and either the left or right wrist. Just because it's so awkward to hold it. It's such an unnatural position to be sitting here just holding the flute out like this. So as far as just strictly endurance goes, it's just different issues than other instruments have. It's usually not too much of a problem unless there are really, really exceptional circumstances. Anyone else want to jump in?
I'll tell you what, just so that we can keep this running smoothly, why don't you guys just say that you have a question in the chat and just be thinking of them a little bit ahead of time. That might work. Something we've developed with all these webinars.
Yeah.
Also, just so you know, Matt, Colin's going to come on the early side to overlap a little bit so you guys can talk a little bit about being in a wind section, that kind of thing.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. If anybody has something right now, go ahead. Otherwise, I was going to go ahead and ask a question.
Yeah, actually, I have a question.
Hi, Procor.
Hello. Can you talk about a little bit about extended technique like pizzicato, slap tongue, and things like that?
Yeah, all of those things, with the exception of flutter tongue, which is pretty easy to come in and out of. All of those other extended techniques like slap tongue and pizzicato tongue, and I really try to discourage composers from doing like slap fingers. I think there are other things that achieve a similar effect to the audience, but first of all, won't mess up our pads. And second of all, it'll be way more audible to the audience because this sounds nice to composers who are 2 feet away from us, but you can't hear any of it in a hall. But any of the articulation type stuff requires a bit of preparation, so it kind of needs to be spaced out enough that it can be set, and then we do whatever you need to do, and then kind of reset. So if my regular playing position is here, the flute is just below my lower lip, then to do anything like a slap tongue requires me to bring the flute off my face and bring it up, rolled all the way in, so the embouchure hole is in between my lips. So it's not that the notes within the slap tonguing can't be too close. It's just getting into something like that and getting back out to reset to the normal position. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and I've heard that you can speak inside the flute as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. There's a great piece by Toru Takamitsu called Voice, and it's based off of this French poem where the flutist kind of speaks across the instrument. So it's not so much speaking into the instrument. It's not really going to be pitched so much. You can suggest certain fingers to be down, but it's not going to make too big of a difference. So if I were to just do it like across the flute right now. So it's more of a suggestion of pitch rather than something that's really tangible, and it's the voice is really going to be at a whisper.
Thank you.
Sure.
Matt, I was wondering if you might like to bring out your piccolo or talk to us a little bit about that, and also maybe how it ends up that some people end up specializing or not specializing.
Yeah. Well, I think specializing in the piccolo is, I mean, I would like to think something of the past. It's so hard to win a job as a flutist nowadays that everyone really needs to be super proficient on the piccolo unless they're only going to go for straight principal jobs, which are so hard to come by as is. But that being said, the piccolo is an entirely different beast than the flute. Mostly because the bores run in the opposite direction. So for the flute, the top of the head joint is the most narrow part and the bottom of the foot joint is the widest. But on the piccolo, it's the opposite. The head joint is the widest part. The bottom of the body, because there's no foot joint in here, the end of the body is actually the most narrow. So all of our intonation tendencies are backwards from the flute to the piccolo. There is an entirely different set of fingerings for our third octave. And it does take a lot of work to get it. Thankfully, all of this stuff with the vowels and the placement and all that does remain constant, but it's just kind of being aware that all your tendencies are going to be completely backwards. So it's a good thing to know for conductors. So many conductors just blanketly say piccolo sharp, piccolo sharp, piccolo sharp, but actually more often than not, when the piccolo is playing way up there, they're really flat. They're going to be super, super low, especially on like their top Gs, top As, where it likes to hang out and where conductors tend to get on piccolo players' cases. They're really, really low notes. So again, just something interesting to be aware of.
You want to play us a little ditty?
Oh. Oh. How does it go?
Cool. And is that Samaram?
Yep, Samaramidi.
Yeah. And I noticed that you're playing a wooden piccolo. Could you talk a little bit about the materials, maybe the different?
Yeah, so the body of the piccolo is made of grenadilla, which is usually what most full piccolos are made of. It's similar materials to what a lot of clarinets and oboes are made of. My head joint is made of a wood called mopane. It's a harder South African wood, and it just matches really well on my piccolo. Most piccolos that you'll see playing in orchestra are either wood or some sort of composite wood and resin.
I see. And anything else about the piccolo, maybe that, I don't know, that the conductor should know besides what you just said about the intonation? Or what about the fact that sometimes it seems really loud?
Yeah, that's something unavoidable without hard work. I think it's really important to be empathetic towards your piccolo player, because more often than not, they're sitting there for like 20-30 minutes doing nothing and then coming in on a cold wood instrument. So as a conductor, just if it sounds hard, give them a minute or two and then start to get on their case.
And what about the alto flute, which has such an amazing sound?
Yeah, it's the most warm, rich sound of the flute family, I think. It's so beautiful. It's pitched in G, so thankfully the tuning of the instruments in more modern instruments is pretty good. But for a flutist, it's just kind of odd to get your ear going from a C-pitched instrument to a G-pitched instrument. Same thing for, I'm sure, an oboist first time picking up an English horn or something like that. But that just kind of amplifies the volume problems that I was talking about with the regular concert flute. The alto flute, even the best made, most modern alto flutes just don't have a huge sense of projection. So things like Rite of Spring, where you're fighting through a crowd of 100 people, is so hard as an alto player. And of course, those are the only pieces where alto gets used is when you have a massive orchestra.
Thank you. Anything else about the auxiliaries that would be good for people to know?
Not really. I mean, bass flute is so rarely used in orchestra except for very, very contemporary pieces. So it's not really even much of a worry. I guess that Procore's the only composer, right? Write more for alto flute. It's so great. And all of the same extended technique ideas can be applied to any of these flutes, which is good.
I like what Joan Tower said in one of the webinars recently, that there are a lot of pieces written for flute because you guys are really nice and you ask for them or something.
Yeah, it's true. I actually wrote about that. I don't know if you were reading our responses from that week, but I wrote about how when I was, I don't know, 15 years old and went to my first National Flute Association convention and saw all this new music being played, I kind of just thought that's how it was. But if you look at the websites for like the International Horn Society or the International Double Reed Society or any of those, they're not nearly as saturated with new music as the NFA is. I looked in last year's program book, and there were like 400 works performed in the 4 days by living composers. So it's crazy, and I just thought that's what everyone wanted, but it's really kind of unique to the flute community.
It's interesting, and certainly advocates like Carol Winsence are, big in that too. But it seems to be also part of the culture. So
Yeah, totally.
who's out there, write for something else.
Yeah.
No, I don't. Well, Colin has arrived. So unless there are any more specific questions for Matt, maybe we could talk a little bit about the wind section, and then we can talk about the clarinet. Do you folks have anything more specifically for Matt? All right, Colin, welcome. Can we say hello to you?
Hi.
Hi. Can we make sure you're loud enough, actually?
Yes. Can
Okay,
you hear
okay,
me?
then that's
Should
good.
it be
That's
louder?
good.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was wondering if the two of you might like to go back and forth and talk a little bit about playing in a wind section, in terms of who might be kind of internally leading, even though the conductors, of course, think that they're leading, but there are other things going on, or in terms of intonation, um, and then anything, just kind of specific for the conductors that they should be watching out for. Maybe, well, Matt already talked a little bit before you got here about balancing, the flute may have the most difficulties with projection, but just anything along those lines that might interest us.
Sure. I mean, I will let Matt take the lead on the age-old question of oboe versus flute in terms of leading. But thankfully, usually, unlike in our conductor readings, I'm in the second row. And so there's always a good head in front of me to help follow. One thing, though, that you mentioned that I think is important to note, I don't know if it's been said yet, but is the pitch tendencies of instruments as they get warmer when they're played. And not all instruments do the same thing. So clarinets, for example, get sharper as they get warmer, which I think is different than most other woodwind
Really?
instruments.
Just kidding.
Yes, we're always sharp.
And how do you handle that? Like, would you know then to pull out before your next solo as it's getting hotter on stage, or?
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I kind of know my instruments well enough to know kind of how gradually they get warmer, and I just, adjust in the instrument. It's definitely, it can be an issue if you're not playing for a really long time because depending on what the stage is like, your instrument could actually get colder. Um, so sometimes you'll actually see, especially in pits, people will have little like instrument sleeping bags that you can kind of, if your instrument is sitting on a peg for a really long time, you can get these kind of like instrument cozies that keep them from getting too cold. So I would say that's something to keep in mind, but it's something that can come up. But I think nowadays it's really up to the player to know those tendencies and just be prepared to always be in tune.
So if one of our conductors is working with a possibly less experienced orchestra that might not be taking care of the tuning themselves as much, would it make sense then not to start a rehearsal by tuning, or when's a good time in a rehearsal to actually work on tuning?
I think something that was always kind of drilled into me as a young musician was to make sure you're always arriving with plenty of time to warm up. So that way your instrument is kind of already at its, what one of my teachers used to call the Goldilocks zone, not too warm, not too cold, but just right, kind of where it's going to sit for the rest of the rehearsal. So I would say definitely leading young groups. That's, I mean, you hear it all the time that early is on time and on time is late. But in terms of getting the instrument up to pitch, that's really significant for wind instruments.
Matt, you want to say some more about, playing in a section, especially from the conductor's point of view?
Yeah, I think it ends up defaulting to lead the wind section a lot to the flute player, just because we have the most visible instrument to the whole wind section. Um, I love it when an oboist shares the responsibility, um, just because it's hard to maintain leadership. I mean, it feels like I am. You're gonna hate this, Erica. The concert master of the wind section and serving.
No, I mean, when I was concertmaster, I'm looking over at you and the oboe and the timpani. No, they're absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to have a flutist who can make contact with the concertmaster as much as possible. I always try to arrange my seat so I can see the concertmaster. So I hopefully in turn will be able to communicate all of that to the wind section, and I'm right in front of them. Um, Thankfully, having Gigi sitting next to me for the last 3 years, she loves to lead as well when it's appropriate. Um, so anytime that I feel like the oboe should be leading the line, I'm kind of defaulting to them. I think it's totally appropriate to kind of lean slightly into the person. That's their cue to take over a bit, and they're usually very responsive. And then I still, though, sort of act as a bit of a timekeeper, even if I'm not having the primary line, and being super in tune to what the oboist wants to do, so that the back row really knows what they're doing, because obviously they can't see the bell of the oboe player who's trying to lead.
How much can it get in the way of certain techniques? Like maybe you need to just hunker down and hold your flute and play something really complicated. Are there?
Sometimes that happens. Thankfully, when that happens is usually at a time where it's kind of like set it and forget it type of thing. Like second movement of Shasti 10, everyone's really going. No one's really looking up too much because they have so many notes to worry about. So I can kind of back off on that front. But it's important for flutists to kind of learn to train this entire apparatus from like your chest to the top of your head, including your arms, all as one unit. So that way the flute stays anchored on the lip. So if I'm going to make any sort of movement, I'm really doing it with my entire upper body and not just with the flute, because that's when you're going to run into the sound issues. And that can usually be managed, except for, like you said, the super, super technical passage times.
I'm curious, did Ransom Wilson ever talk to you about some of that stuff? Because he was and probably still is a master, since he's a great conductor and flutist. He was a master at leading from the flute. Did he ever actually talk about it, or did you just kind of work it out yourself?
No, well, I was with Randy Bowman.
You worked with him, did you?
No. I was with Randy, and yeah, he talked about that all the time, and just being super, super sensitive to when I should be leading with sound and when I should just be leading with body and when I should totally give it up. And yeah, it's such an acute awareness that really only comes from sitting in the orchestra a lot.
Great, that's really helpful.
Hey, I have a question. For you guys, like this also pertains to us. How from y'all from your point of view, how do you feel a conductor should sort of act towards you in terms of like when you have a solo? Because I know like sometimes we'll try to micromanage when really, sometimes it's good to kind of just sit back and be like, okay, you got it. So like how do you guys feel in regards to that?
I think it can be tricky when there isn't like an expansive rehearsal time or period. So like normally any big solos, I would like to, you know, kind of step aside or find a time outside of rehearsal just to talk with the conductor if it seems like there are any things that need to be worked out. I kind of think that is the, you know, the better time to do it as opposed to in the middle of a rehearsal. Um, and then in terms of just the actual conducting, I think it really depends on the solo in question, and especially to how much else is going on. Um, I think if it's, you know, and also just like the mood. I don't know. It's hard to give a clear answer. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I agree. I think from a conductor standpoint, I would think about, does the player sound like they're really committed to this idea? Do I like this idea? And then would I be okay getting everyone on the same page as this idea that the player proposed? And if you disagree, then that's when you as a conductor can and should step in and try to rearrange what's going on, change shaping, whatever it may be. But I think it's really, I always personally like it when a conductor gives me a chance to go through an entire solo first, and then they think about those things, and then we can go back later and make any of those adjustments. Does that answer your question?
It really doesn't. Any other big questions for, kind of section play stuff, or just Matt, before you go away, are there any further questions from Matt, or anything, Matt, you would like to, say to the group? Which, and by the way, this, although right now we don't have composers except for Procore here, this will be listened to again by other composers too. So for both.
I think I got everything out on my end, unless anyone has any questions. I'm just here for the balance. That's my biggest thing. Just make my life a little bit easier.
You will.
Thank
Now
you.
we know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very much, and both of you guys made these amazing videos. They're really really great.
Yeah.
So good. Then Colin, people have questions for Colin in the clarinet world.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Hi, thank you, Matt.
Could you talk about? Oh, go ahead, Micah.
No.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, fine. Let me see, because I wrote this. You were talking about the different registers, like in relations to the keys. Could you kind of talk about that?
Sure. As I mentioned in the video, one of the things that makes the clarinet different from especially the oboe and flute is that when it changes registers, it doesn't go up by an octave, but it goes up by a 12th. So I mainly put that in there for the benefit of composers, just when writing certain things. But essentially, it means that, so on the back of the instrument, we have this key here, the register key, which takes the clarinet up, like I said, a 12th. So mainly just knowing that if a figure is written in one octave and then is transposed up an octave later in the score, it especially if it's particularly like noodly, that it's not necessarily going to be as easy or as hard as it was further down. And I think another good thing to keep in mind is that anything that goes between B flat and B natural in the middle of the staff, that is what we call the break, the infamous break. And basically it goes, so the key positioning for B flat is just two buttons that each actually raise a key and uncover a tone hole. And it's kind of the least stable note on the instrument. So that's B flat. And then B natural, just a half step up, switches to where we keep the register key down, but we put our thumb down and then we put down every single finger, and we make sure that through some key combination, all of these pads down here are depressed. So it's essentially the lowest note of the clarion register. Um,
Oh, Collin, come back. Come back to us, Collin.
and
I'd like to advertise the Bard Conservatory of Music in this time period. Oh,
I'm
there you
back, I think.
go. Okay, great.
Sorry, it says my internet connection is unstable. It's been going in and out all day.
We got the clarion register.
Yeah, so just knowing that the B natural is the lowest note of the clarion register, and going from any are we back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oy vey. And try one more time.
Yeah. Let me try something real quick. Sorry, there was someone else on the Wi-Fi was also doing a video call, and so we've kind of shifted things around. So hopefully this will be better.
So, clarion.
Yes. So anyway, just knowing that anything that goes to a B natural or higher, if it's like from a G or an A natural or A flat, even though they're close together, it's a lot of moving around. So going over the break is something that clarinetists work on all their lives. We do tons of exercises for it, but it is something that can be tricky. So for example, something that where this comes up is in the opening of the second suite from Daphnis and Chloe, where it's all of a that's all over and around the break, which is why that excerpt is asked on so many auditions. So that's one orchestral example of how that makes things extra tricky. Did that answer the question? Did you want me to say anything else? Or okay.
Glenn? I guess it answered the question.
I have, I'm sorry.
Please, Procor.
Yeah, I have a question about the break.
Yes.
So Rimsky-Korsakov wrote a book on orchestration very, very long ago. And in time of Rimsky-Korsakov, he suggests not to write expressive melodies around the break and a little bit below, like B flat, A flat, and G. He suggests not to use these notes. Maybe it was the case in time of Rimsky-Korsakov, but what about now?
Yes. So that goes back to just how all of these notes from B flat to essentially F sharp, we call them throat tones. I guess I'm not entirely sure where that metaphor comes from actually, but they're notes that because you have so few fingers down, they can be somewhat unstable sounding. Especially for younger players, getting a really good, beautiful tone on those notes can be difficult because there's so little of the actual instrument that is resonating. Um, Essentially, the more fingers you put down, you're creating a seal, and that allows more of the instrument to resonate. So when we get up to something like B flat, where there are no tone holes being covered, and in fact we're opening up to more tone holes, it just makes the instrument even less resonant. So there's lots of things that we do with our air, with the inside of our mouth, with your embouchure, to kind of make those throat tones more resonant. and I think that instruments also have gotten a lot more advanced since the time of Rimsky-Korsakov as well. So that helps in this way as well. I would say that nowadays it's possible to get a really beautiful tone on throat tones, and it kind of is its own special section of the instrument's range. So
Awesome. I've been
Hi,
hi, so sorry.
no
don't worry
problem.
about it. You want to go on? And then, you had such an incredibly complete video that if this happens again, I think we probably are happy to say thank you and goodbye.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, I was really just saying that I wouldn't worry too much about writing in those notes nowadays, just because the instrument has kind of advanced far enough. But that is an area that young clarinetists can struggle with in producing a really beautiful tone quality of the same type that you would get in other ranges of the instrument.
Any other questions for him? I wish you had some of the auxiliaries because it would be great to hear you play those, but
I know.
that's all right.
Colin, I asked Matt this as well, but like Erica said, your video is so thorough, so thank you so much about the mechanics of the instrument. I just asked, is there anything in particular that you think we should know as conductors? Are there like certain like either pet peeves or like things that you wish conductors knew, or things that conductors ask for maybe without fully knowing how difficult that is, or fully knowing, about the instrument?
Sure. Um, well, actually, going back to the throat tones, so basically anywhere between F and B flat, those can be difficult notes to project. Um, so I think knowing that, I mean, just as the same with many woodwind instruments, the higher notes are going to be easier to be heard than the lower notes. And just understanding that we might be playing as loud as we can. But I think it's also good to always just, keep asking for the kind of sound that you're looking for. And it's up to us to try and figure out, ways to push our instruments to be the best that they can be. Um, I would also say I don't know if anyone has ever has brought this up in previous things, but probably. But one thing that I think Matt was mentioning is that sometimes my line of eye can be kind of more with other players than with the conductor. So just knowing that, but I think that's fairly standard nowadays. Um, I think you can usually always ask a clarinetist to play softer if needed, because we are really able to play quite softly in mostly all registers. I mean, it's going to be more difficult with higher notes, but um, even with higher notes, we have a lot of like alternate fingerings that we can use that help play softer or louder. Um, yeah, but I don't really have too many pet peeves.
That's good.
Yeah.
Colin, I'm surprised you didn't mention this thing that I know happens all the time where a conductor says to start at some place and you don't have the right clarinet ready. But I'll say it for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because we were talking about that with oboe
And harp
as
also because she wouldn't have the tools ready.
right.
Yeah, that is true,
No,
and that I guess is a pet peeve. So uh, it to me it isn't too much of a big deal, just as long as because sometimes you're trying to fit as much as you can into a certain rehearsal period. So I think just knowing that if you're trying to like get back to a place and start another section really quickly and the clarinets aren't playing for the first bar and they're like scrambling, that's why.
yeah.
I certainly don't necessarily mind me taking the time to get my instruments ready, even if the rest of the orchestra has started. That's not something that I'm personally upset about. I think there definitely are clarinetists who would like to be given that time. And certainly if you're starting in a place with a solo or a prominent clarinet line, to just know that we might have to do some sort of moving and maneuvering for that to happen.
What about between movements? I have certainly seen clarinetists telling the conductor to please make sure in the concert
Hmm.
to give them some time. I mean, is that, it seems like it should be obvious, but if there's a musical reason why a conductor might want something almost attacca,
Hmm.
then I guess it could be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that for different orchestral pieces, sometimes we'll actually transpose our own parts if there's a really quick change that needs to happen, and we either don't want to just have it be that crazy. So there are times that we might do that on our own. I don't necessarily think that that's something that should be asked for. But it is something to keep in mind, especially if there's a very soft ending or soft beginning. We kind of, at least me, I try and be as careful with moving my instruments as possible, just because it's like dropping a brass mouthpiece or like something. If you're just like clanking around on your instrument stands right at the end of a beautiful movement, it kind of kills the mood. So yes, I think keeping in mind going through multi-movement pieces, what specific instruments we're using, just knowing that it's different from when horns change keys, like we are physically changing instruments. Um, yeah.
Would it be like would you recommend asking, like touching base with maybe the wind section in general, saying like, hey, are there any spots where you guys need me to wait for you, or should we just kind of eyeball it?
Um, I would say that that's really, in my opinion, I think it's more up to the player
Okay.
to present the conductor with any specific accommodations that might need to be met. But of course, that's going to vary group to group and player to player. Um, I would say, like I said before, kind of let a few rehearsals go, do it at your own pace as the group gets accustomed to either you, if you're new to conducting them, or just a new piece that we're all working on together. I think it's okay to give it a few rehearsals, depending on the length of the cycle, um, to kind of let everyone get into their groove.
You were really clear describing all the various clarinets in your video, and I understand that the C clarinet is really pretty rarely played these days. But I was wondering if you knew of any specific websites that work for finding transposed parts, both for the C clarinet, but also as a conductor of a community orchestra. I've actually found for other instruments too. Sometimes I need the trombones to be transposed. We had a situation where we didn't even have any A clarinet instruments for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and I found some websites that had transposed parts, but they were actually terrible. So I don't know if there's anything particular you know about.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really just check IMSLP. I think that that is kind of where most things are nowadays. So,
They don't have everything though.
yeah, not everything. I mean, yeah, when I was in undergrad, I was an assistant for a youth orchestra, and they were doing Mahler 1 and had no E flat clarinet. So it was my job to transpose the entire E flat clarinet part from Mahler 1 for a B flat clarinet, which I was just like, I don't understand how high school B flat clarinets are even playing this high, but um, it can be tricky. But thankfully, well, another thing to keep in mind is lots of professional clarinetists just learn how to transpose from C. Um, it's really good practice, especially I guess it's kind of going a bit out of style nowadays, just with the ease that people are able to use notation software to transpose parts. Um, but I think there were definitely times where I can't remember, what is it, third movement of Brahms 4, I think, is for clarinet in C, and you would just play it by sight transposition. But I think there are also transposed parts now. Also, some players and some schools have C clarinets as well. So I remember I did my master's at Indiana University, and at one point they did Barber of Seville, which has a lot of C clarinet stuff, and they just thought, this was a great time to pull out the two great C clarinets that school had, and give the players some experience playing on that. And it really does change the tone. It brings in a whole other aspect of kind of historical performance practice in that regard too. So it's really interesting the different ways that it can be managed.
Great, thank you. Okay. Do you guys have any more questions?
Feel free to always send me an email or
Okay.
a Facebook message if anything comes up in the future. I'm happy to help.
Maybe we should not push it with the internet service and just say thank you so much. Such a thorough and professionally presented video. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, I love the excerpts at the end.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I
Great.
just want to throw some of those in.
Loved it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Collin.
Guys.
See you guys
Thanks.
with what are we doing? I think some kind of brass instruments. I'll write to them now and make sure they're all ready to go.
Oh, great.
Great. Take care.
Thanks again. Thanks, Erica. Bye.